This sermon today is one I've wanted to preach for a while. It was on my list of sermons to eventually preach, and when I was invited to preach on Labor Day weekend, my initial thought was to deliver a sermon on labor concerns and workers' rights. I may still preach that sermon someday, but my interest shifted when I was away on vacation in Spain in July. While there, I read in the news that the president sent out especially nativist and racist tweets on Twitter, which attacked 4 liberal congresswomen, telling them to go back to the crime-infested places from which they came. It wasn't the first time that the current occupant of the executive branch had been accused of racism or nativism, of course. As with so many other previous statements or actions, this one seemed to cross a line, though. For those of us who have immigrant backgrounds within living memory, the thought of a leader telling someone, especially another elected official, that it would be better for that person to self-deport because of policy differences was not just hostile and petty, but also a clear renunciation of our national motto, that out of many, we are one, regardless of our ethnic heritage. Since that unfortunate incident this summer, I've been thinking about the ways we describe our Unitarian Universalist heritage and who we center in that narrative and who is sidelined. If you've read any mainstream narrative history of our faith, or even if you've heard the condensed version of our history at a membership class here, you could be forgiven for believing that Unitarian Universalist history has exclusively been an Anglo-American project centered on people living in New England. That version of our history goes something like this. Religious dissenters, like the Pilgrims and the Puritans, left England, settled in New England, and by the 19th century had become religious liberals, rejecting flawed doctrines and producing heroes like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Theodore Parker, as well as national leaders like John Quincy Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and Millard Fillmore. While there's nothing obviously flawed about that summary version of our faith, and while our Anglo-American heritage is valuable, as is our legacy in the New England region, it's also helpful to consider other contributors to our legacy. Our faith has an illustrious history, filled with stories of brave and curious people who valued the search for truth and goodness more than being conformist or conventional. And that history is not limited to people from one particular ethnic background, then or now. I decided to focus today on our faith's Hispanic heritage for a few reasons. One is that one of the 4 American congresswomen who were told to go back by the president happens to be of Hispanic heritage, specifically of Puerto Rican ancestry, and also happens to represent 2 boroughs in our city in the Congress. And the city, which she represents, happens to be 27.5% Hispanic, according to the latest census. In addition, much of the hostility that surrounds the debates on immigration and assimilation in our country tend to be directed toward people of Hispanic ancestry, even when that isn't explicitly stated. Our country shares not just a border, but a wider intercontinental legacy with the rest of Latin America, which goes back well before the founding of our country. For example, St. Augustine, Florida, Santa Fe, New Mexico, and San Juan, Puerto Rico were all founded by the Spanish a century before the English colonized Jamestown, and Spanish missions had been established in California well before the 13 English colonies on the East Coast declared their independence from Britain. In the 21st century, while just 13.4% of Americans speak Spanish as a first language, the total number of Spanish speakers is estimated to be 58 million, making the USA the 2nd largest Spanish-speaking country in the world, second only to Mexico. The more we look at our nation's history, the more we see how our heritage isn't as homogeneous or monolingual as it might initially appear, and the same can be said of Unitarian Universalism. While this one sermon cannot adequately present a completely comprehensive treatment on the subject, I hope to be able to highlight a few characters and events which I hope you'll find meaningful. The first character I'd like to introduce to you is Michael Servetus, whose Spanish name was Miguel Serveto. Born in 1511 in Aragon, Spain, he was now what we would consider to be a Renaissance man, for his interests and talents in the fields of linguistics, medicine, theology, mathematics, geography, poetry, jurisprudence, and more. Due to his intellectual talent, rather than inherit his father's notary business, he was sent to France to pursue studies in law. After graduation, an influential friar named Juan de Quintana befriended him, and Servetus became his assistant. Quintana became the personal confessor to Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire in 1530, and that same year, Servetus accompanied Quintana to Bologna for Charles's coronation. While there, Servetus observed the excessive splendor and pageantry surrounding the Pope, which repelled him and alienated him from the Roman Catholic Church. This journey to Italy was decisive in shaping Servetus's thoughts, and he later visited Augsburg, where he came into contact with Protestantism, which he found more sympathetic to his views, such that he later went to Basel and Strasbourg, where he could explore his beliefs with other reformers without the fear of persecution. In 1531, while in Strasbourg, after 4 years of further study, thought, and writing, he published a book which separated him theologically, not only from Catholicism, but also from the other forms of continental reform movements. His book, titled De Trinitatis Erroribus, which in English is On the Errors of the Trinity, created an enormous amount of controversy because it was critical of the prevailing doctrine of God as the divine Trinity, while also being critical of the doctrine of original sin, the practice of infant baptism, and challenging certain interpretations of Scripture. The level of scholarship he produced at such a young age astonished many, while his ideas horrified many of his contemporaries, causing him to be seen as a heretic. From his studies, he came to see the historical figure of Jesus as a human being upon whom God had bestowed divine wisdom, and whose mission on earth was to be a prophetic messenger of God, but who is not eternally existing from before the beginning of creation. Because of his views, Servetus was forced to relocate, and in 1536 he settled in Paris to study medicine. While he pursued the study of medicine, he continued to express interest in religion, and in 1546, Servetus corresponded with the Swiss reformer John Calvin, sending him elaborate manuscripts on his theological views, to which Calvin responded by letting Servetus know that he would not be welcome in Geneva. Oddly, their correspondence continued, with each one sending his treatises and responding with annotated criticism. In 1553, Servetus was arrested in France by the Inquisition for heresy and was condemned to death. He managed to escape from prison, and an effigy along with his books were burned instead. He tried to make his way to Italy and inexplicably went through John Calvin's Geneva to get there, where he was arrested, charged, and convicted of heresy and blasphemy. On October 27, 1553, Servetus was burned to death on top of a pile of his books in Geneva. While Servetus's books and body were burned, his ideas and legacy remain alive to this day. For us modern-day Unitarian Universalists, Servetus's pioneering life and the tragedy of his death inaugurated the history of modern liberal religion, and we celebrate today not just his anti-Trinitarian views, but also the value of religious tolerance, that no doctrine is so sacrosanct that it can't be examined or challenged further, and each person is free to follow one's conscience in the search for truth and meaning. The second historical figure I'd like to share with you is Joseph Blanco White, whose birth name was José María Blanco y Crespo. Born in 1775 in Seville, Spain, to a family of mixed Spanish and Irish descent, he distinguished himself as a theologian, poet, journalist, and literary critic. At the age of 25, he was ordained as a Roman Catholic priest, However, he began to have doubts about his vocation and faith and worried that he could be persecuted by the Spanish Inquisition for his views. And so in 1810, he relocated to England, where he studied theology at Oxford and transferred his ordination to the Church of England, which he found to be more sympathetic to his views. While in England, he wrote for and published several periodicals to promote greater understanding between his native and adopted lands, as well as advocating for the independence of the Spanish colonies in the Americas, which was a very controversial position at that time. He also served as a tutor to the family of Richard Whately, a then newly appointed bishop in the Anglican Church of Ireland and a noted liberal. While living in Ireland with Whately's family, Blanco's theology developed in a more Unitarian direction, and he became increasingly disillusioned with the Anglicanism he had embraced, as he found it to be no less dogmatic than the Roman Catholicism he left behind in Spain. In his criticism of religion in general, he came to understand the ways in which theology was being used for political ends, how mysticism was used to manipulate people's emotions, how truth was falsely linked with antiquity, and the distorted belief that Christ was sent to earth to tell people what to think versus how to live. Blanco was also concerned with recovering the original spirit of Jesus and the first Christians, without the accretions of later theology or dogma. He questioned the biblical foundation of church doctrines and became convinced that any scriptural passage which allowed for several meanings could not convey essential information or be used to define doctrine. Otherwise, he wrote, God would be, quote, setting a trap for humans. He thus came to the conclusion that, quote, the acknowledgement of the divinity of Christ cannot be one of the essentials of Christianity, since that was a subject which good people could disagree on. Worried about the bishop's approval of his free-thinking ideas, he left his tutoring job and relocated to Liverpool, England, where he became involved in 2 Unitarian societies. There, he finally found where he belonged, and he noted in his journal that, quote, I had never witnessed anything so really sublime as the whole worship in which I was joining. I heartily thank God for having been made acquainted with the Unitarian worship. I have seen nothing superior nor even equal to it. Blanco was never in very good health and suffered from both hypochondria and melancholia. 6 years after moving to Liverpool, he died in 1841, with his last words being an affirmation of his Unitarian faith. At his funeral, the leading Liverpool memorializes Blanco. His legacy in his native Spain had been neglected for many years. However, with the renaissance of democracy in Spain at the end of the 20th century, Blanco's writings and legacy have been rediscovered, where he is now celebrated for his thoughtful challenges to political, intellectual, and theological authoritarianism. Of course, having introduced you to these 2 historical figures, our tradition's Hispanic heritage doesn't end at the 19th century. Much more could be said, but I'd like to highlight how, in 2009, our denomination published a Spanish-language hymnal titled Voces del Camino, or Voices on the Journey, which was the result of a grassroots effort by the Spanish-language ministry at the Unitarian Church of San Jose, California, and which congregations across the country can now use. Also in 2009, our denomination elected its first Hispanic president, the Reverend Peter Morales, one of the first denominations to do so. Our congregations are enriched by both our heritage and those who continue to carry on the legacy of liberal religion across ethnic and language differences. And so, as contemporary Unitarian Universalists of many backgrounds, who we are is not defined by any one tribal identity. While today's service focuses on our Hispanic roots, I could just as easily have preached one about our Italian roots or our Hungarian, Romanian, Polish, or Indian heritage. While we may be living in a time when voices telling people of foreign backgrounds to go back are centered in the national media, we are also living in a time when the degree of ethnic diversity present in our nation is unprecedented and in many places celebrated and honored. As people of faith, we who come from every ethnic and religious background cannot say to another Unitarian Universalist, "Go back home," because in this home, all are welcome. You don't have to change who you are as a precondition of being part of this community. And at our best, we cherish the wise insights we each bring here. In the poem we read this morning, the poet wrote that, quote, "The word is full of voice, though no one speaks it." In whatever word or language we use to describe the love that is at the heart of our faith, may we always speak it with wonder and appreciation for those who are our forebears from every tribe and language and people.